the Business Pants bonus episode on Thursday, September 21st. I am Matt Moscardi. I am about to be joined by Damian Rollis and one Mr. Daniel Cash. It's a bonus episode because we have a special guest. He is the author of Modern Credit Rating Agency, The Story of Moody's, which you can pre-order or pick up now. We had a long talk yesterday, and we covered the messy history of creating ratings, how credit ratings were formed, how it relates to ESG and ESG ratings, how messy that is, and the real goal of regulators of ESG, because spoiler, it's not getting the right answer. It's not the one ESG to rule them all. It is something else entirely. But Daniel Cash has now written the book on the history of Moody's. It's the one of the only ones you can find. And it's a fantastically interesting conversation we had with him. We actually excerpted some of it yesterday, but here's our conversation in full. Sit with Daniel while he schools us all. Here's the bonus episode. All right, we're recording. We're here with Daniel Cash. Daniel just wrote a book called A Modern Credit Rating Agency, The Story of Moody's. It comes out this week, September 21st, 22nd, comes out really soon. You can pre-order it now. And just to set the stage for who we're talking to, because you're way smarter than I am. You're at Aston University now. You led ESG ratings at Ben McQuay? Is that how you say it? Ben McQuay.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a law firm, right? Fulbright scholar, bachelor's in criminology, then master's in law, and a PhD in securities law. First of all, I don't know who does that. That sounds incredibly masochistic, but good for you. Yeah. And general overall smart human. Daniel, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's really good to be here. I'm a big fan of the podcast, so I'm glad it's my turn.
You don't have to lie at the start. We don't have
No.
We don't have to start with lies, Daniel. We don't have to start with the lies.
No, I wouldn't.
All right. So I asked you here to talk about, you wrote the book, now literally wrote the book on the history of Moody's. And I wanted to talk about credit rating agencies and some things about them. I want to juxtapose them to like ESG ratings and carbon markets and things like that, because you have experience in those things. But let's start at the top. I did a little bit of research back in the day when I was at MSCI about how the credit ratings came to be in Mercantile Agency, Louis Dupin, and how it became Dun & Bradstreet, and Moody's and Dun & Bradstreet merge. And that's where the Moody's story and John Moody sort of fit into this. But back in the day, the credit ratings were effectively like, they'd write down like how much money you have and whether you were having affairs and you were a Christian and whether you were like, like all sorts of, and it sounds just like kind of like an ESG rating mixed with, it's like money mixed with other stuff. And it really sounds like that. I want to actually, can you kind of elaborate, expand on the messy history of making, like the start of it, like how a rating gets done in the first place, how these rating agencies happen, what a fucking disaster and mess it is for a long time until they hit maturity. Like, what's it look like?
Okay, so I think when somebody asked me about credit rating agencies, and they, like myself, when I first looked at it, they get confused at how you have an industry with so many issues, yet they're so profitable. So in terms of profit ratios, they're in the top 5 companies on the planet. And people get confused of why that is. But I think the reality is I'll give you a very brief history of them. It kind of explains why we have them. So the first sort of credit rating entities as we know them were started in England. And that was through trade societies, and they wanted to come together to make sure that their members were protected against those who were trying to rip them off and swindle them and what have you. So they would collect information on local business people. When the large British financial houses like that of Baring Brothers were crossing the Atlantic to try to take advantage of the growing railroad industry in the US, they struggled to extend credit to those who they didn't know. So what they did was they would hire very influential business people on the US East Coast who would collate information about people coming into the likes of Boston and New York, and they would collate information on them. The first commercial practice, yes?
They're like getting off the boat in Boston and
Yes.
New York, and someone's there being like
Well,
5'7", smells
there you go.
terrible. Like,
Well, I think the reality is at the base of everything to do with credit is a simple question. How do you trust somebody you don't know? And that's it.
Yeah.
And at that basis is the
and would
question.
they would just take their word for it?
Well, the people...
It was just
So the people
self-reporting?
who the Baring brothers used to use, so his name was Thomas Ward, was extraordinarily influential on the East Coast. He was very well respected, and it was his respect that they utilised. So people would feed information into him, and he would collate it in a very, very
Oh, okay.
advanced manner for the time. It's very statistical. But then
Yeah.
that was it was very expensive because they had to pay him a lot of money, and you couldn't
Right.
scale it. The first commercial rating agency was in 1835 by a small law firm in New York City called Griffin, Cleveland and Campbell, but they folded pretty quickly because of the time. It was a very turbulent economic time for them. So a couple of years later, somebody called Lewis Tappan, who's very famous if you know anything about the anti-slavery movement in the US, because he was connected to the Amistad story in terms of he provided legal counsel for them. He essentially created what was called the Mercantile Agency, and that was the first ever commercial rating agency. Notable characters who worked for him, who reported to him, include Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, when he was a
Really?
lawyer in Chicago, was one of Tappan's reporters. And he essentially spread across the whole country. So he formalised the agency structure where you would have different agencies and branches across the country. It was well received and not well received in equal measure. So people were calling it a system of espionage. People did not like that. You could essentially, those reporters around the country could essentially destroy their competitors by reporting that they were not good to deal with and
Sure.
bring credit to. So essentially that's the basis. And then it grows and grows and grows with
So-
the growth of the railroads.
I mean,
See, just like ESG, Matt, it started with a woke
that's what I was gonna say.
anti-racism
I mean, it's
individual.
literally,
Yeah.
it's like the same people. And now it's like, so should we expect eventually, this isn't really the question about credit ratings, but should we expect eventually that, you know, Henry Fernandez of MSCI gets a bridge named after him outside of New York for being offering woke data ratings?
I think we'll expect that won't.
Yeah, all right. We won't
Yeah.
commemorate that bridge yet.
I think I'd love to
but,
be
all
there
right,
to
so
see the
it's-
opening of that bridge personally.
It's a very small bridge.
Yeah, it's a 4-foot bridge. So it's a messy beginning, and they're formalizing it and scaling it, and it becomes.
And it's also
effectively
based in,
what we think of as
just to interrupt,
Moody's.
it's based in a very evangelist movement because of Tappan. So he was against things like, he was very
Okay.
much into prohibition and living a very puerile lifestyle. So any business people who didn't follow that were usually negatively rated by his firm, which goes into what you're saying about this ideological background.
Well, so
Yeah, I mean, but that does go along with like what we refer to here in the United States as the
Yes,
Yankees.
yes.
Like it's the Northeast, the New England part of so it's not surprising that you will see that attitude mixed with an anti-slavery attitude. Like they seem like they're
Absolutely, and he
opposing viewpoints.
He
but
really
yeah.
struggled to expand his business in the South, which is not surprising because they didn't take to a Yankee telling them whether they were good at business or not. So that was essentially the existential problem of the early rating.
Yeah, it's funny when you say these things because it's not hard to think when we talk about Tappan and we talk about what you're talking about with the Yankees versus the Southerners, is that a lot of this still persists in kind of the same way. Like the turf war is not so different.
Well, you
I
could
mean,
say,
but anyway, go ahead, Matt.
the current ESG ratings, right? And we used to talk about this all the time, heavily favor or are biased towards Western companies. And if you're in Asia, right, like you basically have the Yankees telling the South the same thing. It's just global instead of local, right? It's
we have the same thing now
Western,
with the likes of Mia Mottley, the Barbados Prime Minister, who's really pushing the reform of global financial architecture, which is the global north versus the global south. Because if you are, let's say, a European country, the credit rating agencies are usually favourable towards you. But if you're an African country, it's quite the opposite.
Right.
So let's talk about that, because that's the methodological question. And this gets to the heart of sort of my fascination. Like the early methodologies are basically a guy in a room being like, this is what I think should be good and should be bad. And I imagine expands into like a committees. But how does that, like, what's the arc of that? Like, what's the maturity arc of starting with Louis Tappan saying, I want a bridge named after me one day. How do I like make a methodology and scale this to what is today considered, and maybe wrongly so, right? Because this was our conversation on social. Like it's considered a highly algorithmic outcome, and credit ratings tend to be highly correlated. But actually, it starts with a lot of numbers that are algorithmic, and it ends still in a room in a committee with a bunch of people raising their hands that that's the right rating, and it's still a black box. What's the arc of that? Does it like, when does it start to get algorithmic? When do they start to like collect data points? When do they try to scale those things? What does that look like?
Well, it does depend on what you're rating. So, for example, their rating accuracy for corporate bonds is pretty high. Their rating accuracy for structured bonds is extraordinarily low. And their rating accuracy for sovereign bonds is somewhere in the middle. So it depends what you're rating, but the different agencies take different approaches to it. So I think like Moody's is often considered to be slightly more technical and algorithmic in its approach when it's finding out the data points, when it's dealing with the issuers who are requesting for the rating. But it's only since 2009 that we've even known what the methodologies were. Before that, they were entirely non-public. So it's only after the crisis with the Dodd-Frank Act and the European regulations that we actually get a look at the methodologies. And at the moment in the ESG rating world, because there's no regulations as we speak, that will change soon, but because as we speak there's no regulations, only 50% of the top rating agencies actually publicise their methodologies. The other ones don't even publicise them. So it's because...
I mean, in fairness, credit ratings had 150 years before they had to say what their methodologies are. ESG has been around for in modern ratings, has been around for arguably 20. Yeah.
But in reality, it's irrelevant. It's really irrelevant, because once a credit analyst and a team of analysts deal with the issuer, they get the information they need, they comb the public information, they'll feed it through the methodology, they'll get the weightings that the methodology said they should get for that particular industry, and then it goes into a room and the door gets closed and the rest is you can't know. The only thing that happens in a rating committee is that the documents get kept for regulatory investigation, but then no regulator actually details the element of those documents that they read, even when they turn up to investigate. So the methodology, to me, in my mind, is just one very small part of a very long story, because once it goes into a rating committee, there's no telling what that rating may end up. It's not based on the methodology anymore. It's based on the findings of the committee.
So
Has the
Yeah.
sorry, Matt, has the disclosure of the methodology, has that changed the industry at all, or changed the individual companies? Has it had any effect
Well,
on anything?
the point of a lot of the post-crisis legislation and regulation was focused on increasing competition, and all that's happened since the crisis is the competition's
Okay.
decreased because very, very quickly a rating. The concept of a rating is based upon, and this is what my book talks about, is so if you, in the modern world, it's usually institutional investors who use ratings. Institutional investors have far greater resources than a credit rating agency does, and they deploy those to make sure they're investing properly. They don't rely on credit ratings for their informational content because it's usually very backward looking, it's very out of date. For example, if an institutional investor manager was to rely on a credit rating, they would probably be held liable for doing so because it's so out of date and so useless. The reason why they use them is because it provides a signal, and that signal is very basic to understand, and within that simplicity is its power. You don't need to be a genius to know that AAA is better than C on a sliding scale. And that's all you need to know.
Right.
And that's where its genius comes in. And that's why it really doesn't matter if the methodology is public or how they come to a rating, because as long as you get the signal you need, you can then go and invest in the product that you need to invest in.
Well,
Right.
I mean, it doesn't matter except that, like, they are, I mean, they're in the U.S. anyway, they're nationally recognized agencies, right? Like, and there's only 3 or 4 of them. So they are effectively a regulated monopoly.
Well,
Or
I think there's
oligopoly,
10,
right? Like,
there's 10 NRSROs in total, but 3 of them hold like 85-90% of the marketplace, and 2 of them hold 70%.
That's like saying that's like saying there's a bunch of social media, but we all know that Zuckerberg is basically all of it. So in a way, like the fact that it is still, it doesn't, like, the methodology doesn't matter, feels significant given that there's regulations about insurance companies, what they can, the investment grade pension funds, ERISA funds. There are limitations to actually what signal level they can actually utilize.
Well, interestingly,
And the same
since the
things happen in
financial
ESG.
crisis, that's been changed. So since the financial crisis, you are not allowed to insist on a rating being used. It's called removal of rating reliance. And the whole point was that the government and the state wanted to say that, well, we're not telling you to use them anymore. So if you use them, buyer beware, that's up to you. That misunderstands that they are the only form of creditworthiness understanding that exists in the marketplace. So whether or not you insist on them being used or not, you're still going to have to use them.
This sounds like we have this standardized test in America for students entering university called SATs, and it sounds almost the same because now most universities are saying, if you submit them if you want to, but it's optional. But then the idea, I think, of course, is if you don't submit them, we know you probably didn't get a great score. But the whole thing is, it kind of reminds me of what you're saying, though, right? It's like, because there's also controversy with SATs because there's this, the question of whether there's implicit bias and what does the score really measure and blah blah blah. But it's weird how it's kind of sort of the same.
Why don't you
problems
actually
there.
see divergence of the scores post financial crisis then? Why are they still highly correlated given the fact that, like, the methodologies tend to be black box at the end of the methodology, and there is no regulatory need to hit a certain score in order to be investable? Why do we not see divergence?
Well, there's probably 2 reasons. The first is that they're measuring observable data. So if you're looking at, for example, the corporate strength of a corporation, you can point to specific figures on the balance sheet and such, and you really should all be looking at the same data. Whereas when you look at ESG rating agencies, it's very subjective. If you're looking at, let's say, how green a supply chain is, you may have one firm may have access to more data than another. That's why you have more divergence in ESG than you do credit. And the other thing is, in the credit rating agent industry, they are a very well-functioned, well-designed, natural oligopoly. They have been for a long time, and they know if we produce a rating that goes too far out of whack with the other two, we're going to be the outlier. So they usually only incrementally change. That's why you see, for example, when S&P downgraded the United States in 2011, the other two didn't, and Fitch has only just recently suggested that they were going to change the outlook of the United States while the other two stayed still. You only have very incremental movements, but whereas in ESG, with the likes of MSCI and Sustainalytics and what have you, they are not a natural oligopoly yet. And that's why everybody is complaining about ESG rating agencies, saying there's too much noise.
So they
But it's
want
because
an oligopoly.
everybody wants a natural oligopoly because it's natural, but you can't say that. No regulator on the planet would ever call for less competition. They can only call for more.
Why?
That makes me sad.
Why, in this regard, are we so afraid of outliers?
Well, because you want they don't help.
Why do we assume
They don't
Yeah, go
help
ahead.
if you want a signal. If you want a signal and you have three entities all saying the same thing, that gives your signal strength. That's what happens in the credit rating world. But in the ESG rating world, the same signal gets 10 different versions. And then when you go to use it, you can't rely on it. And this all stems to the modern world is separated by one simple relationship, which is principal and agent. So, for example, let's say all three of us have a pension. We are not interested in monitoring how our pensions are governed on a daily basis. We just want our pension at the end of it, and we want it nice and safe. The best way to do that is you say to your pension manager, you can only invest in AAA, keep it nice and safe, rather than any risky behaviour. That governs what we call an asymmetric relationship, where you don't have the information that you should have, so you use ways and means to jump over the asymmetric gap.
Could you argue though that it's not principal and agent? It is really like the creative thinking versus process thinking in a way, because having an outlier actually, when I see the credit rating agencies and or the ESG ratings and they diverge, right? When I see in carbon markets you have multiple models and they diverge, right? That just seems to be a place where you say, why is it diverging? That's interesting that it's diverged. Like, which one do I believe? Can I see the data with which you got to that conclusion? In fact, it begs questions, which is a good place to be in if you're trying to make an informed decision rather than just saying, oh, they all agree, so I might as well go with it, right? It seems like the problem is more like humans want agreement so that they don't lose their jobs and they don't have to think. Or
Well,
am I being
that's human nature?
reductive?
But that's it. I agree.
I was going to say that's what we all seek.
I agree with you
constantly,
that the questions are good and it should inspire thinking so you get to the truth of the matter. But that's not how humans operate. Humans operate in terms of they need shelter, food, and security. What's happening at the moment in ESG, there is a massive, I think I always equate it to a reservoir, a dam that's blocked. And in the dam, instead of water, you have just incredible resources that are waiting to be invested. But they can't be invested yet because the infrastructure at the bottom of the dam is not ready to let the water flow down. And that's what's happening. And what in the ESG rating world, the regulations are very quietly, if you know what to look for, they're forcing oligopoly, because they know that's the only structure that will allow for that capital to be released. But they can't overtly say it because no regulator can.
That both terrifies me and saddens me at the same
But
time.
it's just a
Like,
movement
I
of
love
capital, and
idea
the
of, like,
whole
divergent-
world is about movement of capital. If the capital doesn't move, the world grinds to a halt, and it doesn't matter whether it's a good example of looking at the likes of China. Whether you're socialist, autocratic, or democratic, it's irrelevant. As long as capital moves, your system moves. If your capital doesn't move, your system doesn't move. And you need, for capital to move as a concept, you need an infrastructure to allow it to move. And that's what credit ratings, good, bad, or indifferent, they're exceptionally good at allowing capital to move. Whereas ESG rating agencies, at the moment, are not good at allowing capital to move because they're not built for that yet.
So instead of forcing this like strange idea of having like a unified thought process, which we know is bad for analytical and critical thinking anyway, when you kind of force people into a corner, why don't we just like take the Olympic scoring method with figure skating, where I'm serious. They throw out the high and low score, they average the other scores. Like, why do we concerning ourselves with forcing all of these disparate agencies to think alike and have a unified thought? Why not just kind of amalgamate them and kind of respect the different thought processes going on? Because a lot of these different thought processes from these ratings this goes back to our original thought about East versus West, is that sometimes they come from different regions. Sometimes they come from different types of people who have a different, attitude of what these scores mean and should mean. And so I feel like, doesn't that respect that process even more, as opposed to trying to find this one?
I agree.
Yeah.
And in an analytical concept, in an analytical conversation, it's absolutely correct that we should do that. But if you think of us three on this podcast, and everybody who's listening to it is likely to have a very base or higher level of financial literacy. They understand simple
I don't
concepts.
think you know our listeners.
Well, you said that, not me. But in the general populace, that financial literacy simply doesn't exist. And when it comes to the law that protects those consumers, they don't expect that financial literacy. And that's why you can't have the system that you propose, where you have a variety of thought,
Right.
and you maybe amalgamate it and maybe get an average score. Because that normal, quote, normal person doesn't know that, doesn't understand it, it's too complex. What they want is a very
who are the
simple
scores
sliding
for?
scale.
Who are the scores for? My
Yeah,
mom.
it's funny you
doesn't
say that,
look at a
Daniel,
credit
because-
rating. Like,
Yeah, but can I just say though, it's funny you're saying this because I'm sure you have the same in the UK with football, but Americans are obsessed with fantasy sports, and they do this very
Yeah.
process
Yes.
daily. They look at rankings from all these divergent news sources. They decide which ones they think are important. They average them together. They can do this. They are capable of this.
Well-
But it's funny that and I appreciate what you're saying. I agree with you, by the way, but the financial literacy of the average person is weak. But it's the same principle.
Well, how
is it not, what we're talking
conspiratorial
about?
shall we go? Because
This is just the
I
boring.
agree.
This is just
Yeah,
more
I
boring.
agree. But I know people who will. I mean, a good example was cryptocurrency. I knew people who would never ever have dealt with financial literacy at all. It comes to cryptocurrency, and they're all of a sudden they're invested in this, they're invested in that. But then when it comes to
And they have like 17
Exactly,
spreadsheets
but
open.
when it comes
and-
to
yeah.
the normal understanding a mortgage, understanding a basic investment, a savings rate, they turn off because I don't know why. So one reason is in my schooling
Fascinating.
history, what we call business studies in the UK was optional 16 plus. It was never forced at like 7, 8, 9, 10. Whereas
Right.
if it was,
Yeah.
people would be much more comfortable with understanding what's seen to be complex financial data. When in reality, it's not that
Yeah.
complex, but the perceived
That's what I mean.
complexity.
It's a sad
is
but
the
simple
problem.
point there.
It's more
'Cause it-
complex to like go to Rotten Tomatoes, which aggregates every movie review, and you're gonna read all of them, and like
Based on natural
Yeah, I
language
mean-
understanding, because a lot of those reviews, Matt, don't even have a
It's
score
like-
on them.
and yet. Oh, well, I want to before we end here, because we could talk about this probably for days, which means we're probably gonna have to have you back. There was something you said earlier about how the analysts, you were talking about the team of analysts, the methodology, like in the end can be largely irrelevant. The team of analysts get in a room. You said, quote, they deal with the issuer, right? And I want to ask about that process because there is a conversation happening now about carbon target setting and science-based targets. And they talk about it in ESG ratings, and they talk about conflicts of interests, the issuer pays model effectively, where when you're dealing with the issuer has paid you as a credit rating to give the rating. And it's not different from a company comes to you and pays you to create a target and then validate that target, which is effectively getting a rating. And in ESG ratings, there are companies that will give a rating and then charge to consult to improve your rating, right? It's all issuer pays. That seems to be at the heart of the business model of credit ratings and the heart of the problem when it comes to like incentive streams. How bad is it in a credit rating, or how natural is it? Like how like there's not another better model. And I'm curious, when you think of it that way, is the ESG, the carbon target setting, all of that, is it really that different from the way the credit ratings do it?
A very quick history lesson. Issuer pay started in 1969. There's two reasons why it started. The first is that the Xerox machine was launched in late 60s publicly, and that allowed subscribers to potentially photocopy and release their subscriptions for free, which is called free riding. So essentially, they were going to be taken out of business if they didn't change. The second reason is that a company, between the 30s and 60s, Dun & Bradstreet was buying all of these different rating companies. They had one called the National Credit Office, and in the 1960s they bought Moody's. In the 1960s, the National Credit Office was giving out AAA ratings, what they called prime ratings, to everybody who wanted one because they paid for it. And what happened in 1970, a railroad company called Penn Central crashed and shocked the economy. What happened was the National Credit Office was found to be really guilty by congressional investigation, and they essentially disappeared into nothingness. In their place stepped up the credit rating agencies who said, we're not like them, we're different. But they just changed their rating model to issuer pays. So we only have a 5-year gap between Moody's applying a issuer pays model and S&P catching up and similarly applying the issuer pays model. In that gap, Moody's ratings went up for issuers by 2 ratings on average because they changed their model. And then 4 years later, S&P's ratings caught up and went up 2 ratings on average because they also changed to issuer pays. The point is, rating inflation is the natural partner of the issuer pays model. The theory of issuer pays is that you get access to information that you wouldn't normally get. But it's impossible to stop that conflict of interest. It's quite literally impossible to do it. And even if you separate the analysts from the commercial people, they then go into the rating committee where the commercial person and the executives of the rating agency sit in the very same room as what are analysts and sometimes junior analysts. So it's impossible to change. And in the ESG space, it's mostly subscriber pays, or what we call investor pays. But that's slowly changing. And once you get issuer pays in the ESG world, that will be the end of what we call the oligopolization, and you'll have the natural oligopoly that all the investors want. So, yeah.
God, that's terrifying. So just to summarize that, ratings inflation is the natural outcome of issuer pays, and firewalls don't work. Meaning, like, any of the ESG ratings, any carbon validation, any of that kind of stuff that are currently issuer pays are exactly the same without the oligopoly. Does that make them, would you say that makes them better or worse? I mean, in a way, it sounds like that might actually be worse.
They're just at an earlier stage of their development, that's all. Because the ultimate goal of a rating industry is to be an oligopoly. Because once you're in it, you can't leave it. It's essentially a job for life. So, a very quick story. When I was starting my PhD, my supervisor warned me not to do it because he said, you're being very specialist and you might not have a job. I said, don't worry, the credit rating agencies will keep me in business for life. I wouldn't worry about that. And believe me, every single day there's a new news story with what they go up to. So, because it's essentially economic rent taking. They've got a place in the economic system and they withdraw rent from it because they can't be punished. So I got it in my whole PhD thesis was based on this simple understanding. They bought the consultancy services from the audit companies after Enron, when Enron was forced to divest their consultancy. They built up this massive consultancy business, and my whole thesis was about you can't have somebody so central also selling consultancy services to issuers when you have issuer pays. It's a massive conflict of interest, and they're generating too much money for you to punish them effectively. The record punishment was there was a settlement in 2013 for 1.3 billion. There was a settlement in 2015 for 800 million. They earned 5 times that from just ancillary services alone. So there's literally no deterrent. So the difference with ESG is at the moment you can deter, and that's the difference. But even when the oligopoly is formed, your ability to deter evaporates. So that's what we saw with the financial crisis.
So I'll end with this question. This has been awesome, and so I'm going to end with this question, which is, I'm going to ruin it. So we do board member analytics and management analytics. We measure the individual performance of board members and their influence and stuff like that. What you're saying, based on your incredibly deep knowledge of this, is that A, we need to make a rating and rate individuals, and B, we need to establish ourselves as an oligopoly. So we need to reach out to our only other competitor and say, let's put press releases out against each other. So
just
that
make
it
sure
looks
there's
like
not a paper trail of that conversation, and you'll be fine.
and then I need to start accepting money from the directors and executives themselves to rate them.
I like this.
I just want to. That's a yes/no question. That's what we should do, Daniel Cash. Yes, no.
That's what Daniel's saying.
Well, my fee for that advice is exorbitant, but you will be earning twice as that. So yes, the answer is yes.
That's it. That was Daniel Cash, author of Modern Credit Rating Agency, The Story of Moody's, which you can pre-order or pick up in stores now. I am going to do that immediately. It was a fantastic conversation. A big thanks to him for joining us. That was Damian Rollis, and I am Matt Moscardi. We are Business Pants and Free Float. If you like what you heard on this show, come back tomorrow. We'll have our Friday wrap of the week. And you can also go to freefloatanalytics.com. This show is sponsored by freefloatanalytics.com. It's where you can get all your director data, individual performance attribution, all the things. Go there, get that. Until tomorrow, goodbye.